So there's a long list of things that I could tell you that Dr. Ono has done. For instance, he has 7 authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited books. He has 47 articles and counting. That number has probably gone up. He sits on the board of numerous journals, but what I want to share with you is something that you can't necessarily tell from looking at his online profile, and that's the tremendous impact he's had on the field of communication, particularly in nurturing scholars such as myself. He's built a critical tradition of communication scholarship, and he's done so at 2 major universities and is now continuing his mandate at a 3rd. I've had the incredible privilege of having Dr. Ono as my mentor, and it's not an exaggeration to say that I got my PhD thanks to him. What is amazing about this is that many communication scholars would not be the scholars they are today were it not for Dr. Ono. Dr. Ono is a scholar who lives the politics he advocates in his scholarship, putting his theory into practice by tirelessly mentoring conventionally disenfranchised students in the academy. Dr. Ono's impact on the field of communication is ongoing and will be long-lasting. He has literally changed the face of the discipline of communication. The successful careers of many scholars, scholars of color, queer scholars, and women is thanks to Dr. Ono's dedication to making academia a safe and welcoming place for us. Today is special for me. I'm so proud to share with you the amazing scholar that is Dr. Ono, but I'm also proud to show him where I work, the colleagues that I work with, and the students that I work with. It's my tremendous honor to introduce Dr. Kent Ono, who's going to be giving a talk called Amusing Ourselves to Freedom, Rhetoric, Immigration, and Dark Tourism. Thank you.
That was the most touching introduction I've ever had, and it's a delight to be here, to see Rachel's university, to see your university, and to meet many of you, and to see some of you who I've known for a while again. So thank you so much. Now you'll notice I'm wearing a coat, and as I understand it here in Florida, this is unusual and maybe wrong-headed. So I hope you'll pardon me. I have to hide the mics and things. And in Utah, it's standard dress. So I'm bringing my culture to you. I want to thank Rachel for that wonderful introduction and for helping to bring me out. Carolyn, who I know is here, yes, and the Grazier Lecture Committee. Chaim Noy, who delights me with his rich humor, and Ambar Basu, who is a wonderful driver late at night and who made the sacrifice of dropping me off on the way home last night. And thank you for being willing to kind of think with me through a kind of journey, a tour, if you will, into thinking about the role of freedom in communication. And what I think is a very, very important role that freedom should have and does have within the field, but as yet has not been sufficiently acknowledged or studied. So I hear there's a little bit of echo, so maybe can I affect the sound here? Okay, I think that might be better. Perhaps there is no concept more important for the humanities and for the humanities today than this concept of freedom. From philosophy to ethnic and justice studies, from the history of revolution and national founding to political theory, from art and artistic inspiration, writing and the writing muse, to freedom of speech and expression, freedom is central to the notions of the good, of life, the social, the political, and of identity. Usually thought of as an individually experienced and acquired freedom, about personhood, about liberation from control and restriction, about being unleashed from oppression and oppressive pasts, and about being unhinged, able to function autonomously, capable of enacting one's will, and acting unselfconsciously. On the one hand, freedom makes money valuable. For instance, as implied by the following phrases: free market economies, freewheeling, free from debt. On the other, freedom is also a social concept relating to social liberation, liberty, and justice, and revolution. And in part, I think, thinking about freedom in the social, in the broad social, in the global social, but also in the environmental social becomes critical to kind of thinking of it in a critical way. At a basic level, freedom has to do with promise, desire, and hope. Yet freedom as a promise is one that can never fully be attained, never fully realized. Freedom as a pure utopic concept, which I think is very important, is unattainable in any material, physical sense. Freedom can never be absolute. Freedom is never pure bliss. We never experience it entirely. Nor is it beyond the social, political, economic, or even emotional limitation. One cannot have freedom outside of a context, outside of the social, beyond the political. One way we know this is the case that subjects enjoy differential access to freedom, which I'll talk a lot about here. Some people have it or have access to it within contexts, while others do not. Freedom is also relative and experienced differentially. So different is the experience of freedom across social hierarchies that some have coined the term unfreedom to characterize a state of inhibition, constant constraint, limitation, imprisonment, slavery, degradation, humiliation, torture, and oppression, and abuse. And thus, freedom is not experienced equally among all people and could be said to exist along a kind of continuum ranging from absolute freedom, which we can never attain, as I've suggested, to absolute unfreedom, which we could associate with death. And for many, before death is what Lisa Cacho calls social death. For this talk, and for my purposes, in the context of communication, freedom is profoundly rhetorical. The rhetorical nature of freedom is apparent in its usage. As Brad Vivian suggests, quote, "The roots of liberal and democratic freedoms are not inherent truths about human nature or the highest knowledge of things, but metaphorical constructs," end quote. Its metaphoricity is extensive, historically and contemporarily. I would suggest that the use of the concept is so replete throughout US politics and culture that in general, we do not have a good sense of what freedom means. When a police officer, after a traffic stop, says to the subject she has detained, "You are free to go now," or when Martin Luther King famously spoke in his I Have a Dream speech, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," or when someone in the classroom utters a racist, sexist, or homophobic comment or word, and when challenged, invokes freedom of speech as a preternatural right. A key part of the job of communication scholars is to know what to say and to analyze this context and to say something beyond something trite or something ideological or something that anyone can access via Wikipedia. I think this is important for us to take time to think about what freedom is so we have something to say when this happens in the classroom, when we think about Martin Luther King's dream, and when we think about all of the contexts in which freedom is invoked. So part of the goal of my talk today is to suggest the wide array of freedom's meaningfulness. Thus, I hope to highlight freedom's taken for grantedness in order to help encourage sustained inquiry on the topic and to provoke discussion, conversation, understanding, and quite possibly action. Additionally, my hope is that through a more sustained conversation about the concept of freedom, communication and rhetorical scholars will offer something unique, not only in the classroom, but whenever freedom is used. So, From a rhetorical perspective, freedom has no singular meaning. Its meaning is contingent upon context, and it is the effect of probabilities, when outcomes cannot be assured or known in advance. That which looks to be freeing, in fact, may be binding or controlling. For instance, acquiring money might appear to liberate one into a seemingly infinite world of commodification, and hence give the subject the imagined ability to purchase products that reward the self and produce endless possible conveniences, advantages, pleasures, and satisfactions. Yet pleasure from monetary power and control is often fleeting. The euphoria from spending is ephemeral. After buying a perfect pair of shoes, and the shoes may wear out, they may go out of vogue, emotional attachments may wane, and the desire for yet another pair, one that has greater promise, greater potential for jouissance, may result. This recurring and repetitive purchasing to satisfy but never ultimately being satisfied is at the heart of Marx and Engels' notion of capitalist revolution. Because desire can never be fully satisfied by capital, new revolutions, Marx and Engels say, of industry, new products, product lines, packaging, marketing, etc., indeed any subtle or radical change in market produces new, similar kinds of desires for repetitive enjoyment and fulfillment. And to some degree, then, capital and money bind us. Freedom is therefore profoundly rhetorical and functions as a totem or a placeholder, a marker of meaning, resonant with possibilities, yet ultimately polysemic in the vast number of ways it can be interpreted, theorized, and employed. As such, some have argued freedom nears meaninglessness, as it cannot be easily anchored to any guaranteed or determining foundation. Given its political and scholarly centrality, however, what accounts for freedom being both, using Michael McGee's description of an ideograph, pregnant with meaning, and in part because of its excessive potentiality, devoid of it. What can we really point to that is ultimately freeing after all? Within the field of communication, a field which until the 1980s, late 1980s, had not published a single work on Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. In fact, in his 1989 article, ostensibly the first published one in a communication publication, titled The Fulfillment of Time, King's I Have a Dream speech, August 28, 1963. Robbie Cox writes in footnote 3, to the author's knowledge, no full-length study of this speech has ever appeared in an SCA, now NCA, journal. Freedom, nevertheless, has been central to the field. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression. These courses are at the heart of media studies and communication law. Freeware, free software, and open and free access to publications, much in vogue, much in conversation right now, relating to library materials and internet materials, are critical to contemporary new media studies. Michael McGee practically made liberty one of freedom's primary synonyms, a master term for rhetorical study, both in his discussion of the origins of liberty and of the feminization of it. And enamored of Foucault's idea that critical thinking without foundation provided a way out of impasses of modernist logical thought, Raymie McCarrow theorized both the rhetoric of domination and the rhetoric of freedom in his famous 1989 essay, Critical Rhetoric, Theory and Praxis. And yet, despite McGee's efforts to understand liberty, and McCarrow's and Cox's, the concept of freedom has been under-theorized and understudied, under-discussed, relatively unknown in communication discourse. Outside of the field, however, recently, a spate of new research has identified different dimensions of the problematics of freedom. this work takes as a given that freedom is not guaranteed and that what walks like freedom and quacks like freedom isn't necessarily freedom. While all of these works recognize the linguistic, discursive, and philosophical malleability of the term, none state outright that central to freedom's multiplicity of meaning and ever-changing utility, dependent upon context, is its rhetorical nature. And thus, just as there is free play in theorizations of freedom, there is not a broader sense that a hermeneutics of freedom requires the theorization of the rhetoric of freedom. So that's what I want to try to do today. So we've talked a little bit about communication, and now I want to talk about these kind of ideas about freedom that are happening in other fields that I think relate to how we might think about it in communication. Perhaps the best illustration of the contradictory and strategic use of freedom appears in Mimi Wynn's book, The Gift of Freedom, War, Debt, and Other Refugee Passages. Focusing specifically on the refugee, Wynn argues that liberal humanist philanthropic discourse and action has positioned the refugee, e.g. those fleeing the 1950s to the 1970s U.S. war in Southeast Asia, for example, as both a benefactor of what she calls the gift of freedom, as well as a permanently indebted subject, one whose everlasting marginal status forever assures a subject's indebtedness. So in other words, the U.S. made a context for the refugee who was forced to leave their domicile and their land in Southeast Asia to go abroad. The U.S. made a context in which refugees could live, right? And at first they were often in camps, and then later, if approved, they were able to gain entry into citizenship. So these are refugees. The complex irony of the relationship between the U.S. and refugees, however, of this relationship of freedom, is that the U.S. launches wars abroad in the names of liberating the South Vietnamese, some of you might recall, liberating Kuwait, many of you will recall, liberating the Kurds, some of you will recall, and liberating women from the Taliban, many of you will recall, which creates conditions, bombing buildings, villages, roads, and people, employing economic sanctions against nations, and using the global mass media juggernaut to defame nations until the nation's leadership relents, that make it impossible for people to live there anymore. Because they become exiles from their own countries, they can never go back. Enemies of their own governments, they're targeted by the people in whose country they once lived. The United States offers refugees asylum. For this act of kindness, this precious gift of liberation, they are then expected to remain indebted forever to the state. Thus, military domination leads to freedom. And freedom results in permanent indebtedness. Freedom is, therefore, conditioned on responsibility, fealty, obligation, and moral and political servitude. Now, you may recall a photo from the Vietnam War period of a girl who is nude running toward the camera. It's a still shot, and you see other people running in the background toward that same camera. It has been labeled accidental napalm, and it's one of the iconic photos from the period. There have been a couple of publications written about this photo, one by Guy Westall called Accidental Napalm Attack and Hegemonic Visions of America's War in Vietnam in Critical Studies and Media Communication in 2011, and by Robert Harriman and John Lucchesi's Public Identity and Collective Memory in U.S. Iconic Photography, The Image of Accidental Napalm, also in CSMC in 2003. Well, Wynn, in her book, in one of the last chapters of the book, focuses in on the girl who is now an adult woman. Her name is Phan T. Kim Phuc, and she is now living in the United States, and there are many articles about her, and she's had work done on her face to make her look more normatively appealing. She is very thankful to the United States for having provided the context of her escape from Vietnam. But Nguyen takes a great deal of time to kind of analyze this situation and suggests that Phuc's freedom and her liberation and her thankfulness are in response and in relationship to the context of domination that the U.S. was engaged in Vietnam. So it's not just simply a kind of matter of freedom and liberty and citizenship, but something far more complex. Lisa Cacho's book, Social Death, Racialized Rightlessness and the Criminalization of the Unprotected, is also concerned with unequal experiences of freedom and contradiction, especially within a legal context. In it, Cacho suggests that a criminalized class, ranging from gang members to people of color more generally, is configured as unworthy, not only of citizenship, inclusion, and power, but also of identity, freedom, dignity, and personhood. She suggests that central to the U.S. legal system is a policy of what she calls differential inclusion. Whereas some classes receive the benefits of legal protection, legal rights, and legal personhood, others against whom the law is defined are denied those very same privileges and protections. Thus, freedom is meted out according to one's identity and identity position, and one's identity is central to the levels of freedom and unfreedom accessed, experienced, and enjoyed. Furthermore, she suggests that social freedom is, in fact, defined precisely against those configured as deserving of unfreedom. So people can't be free without understanding them and understand that freedom without knowing people who are less free, who are unfree. Thus, freedom is determined relationally. Laws written to privilege some in some eras also in practice can reward and punish others whose social status and position is not favored. And she gives a good example in the book, which is actually two different chapters. So I'm talking about two different chapters here. In the book, she compares two incidents of gang violence. One in which the perpetrator is a Southeast Asian gang member, and the other is our perpetrators are young white men from privileged suburban backgrounds, all of whom are youth. With the first, a man is accused of a crime of murder. He is a Cambodian refugee non-citizen and therefore comes to occupy what Cacho suggests is a category of the criminal alien. Because of his marginal status, he was not accorded the same inalienable rights. Have you ever wondered about that term? Inalienable rights that are given to citizen subjects. And as an aside, this notion of inalienable rights has received far too little critical analysis, even within critical immigration studies. As she writes, criminal aliens, quote, criminal aliens are difficult to defend because they occupy so many unsympathetic statuses, end quote. In the case of Kim Ho Ma, this is the person accused of the crime, a high school sophomore, once arrested, he had no release date and became an, quote, indefinite detainee, end quote. Initially, he'd not been proven to have committed any crime at all, and there's still a question about whether he did commit a crime. He was nevertheless, because of his non-citizenship status, detained and then ultimately deported. For Cacho, because of his refugee and non-citizen status, because he was accused of a crime, because he was a gang member, he fell into the category of populations, and this is her term, ineligible for personhood, end quote. In contrast, and this is another chapter, 6 white suburban high school young men in San Diego allegedly hunted down what they falsely thought were undocumented Mexican migrants and ultimately beat one of them all the way to unconsciousness before then dragging his body behind a bush and leaving him for dead. A new California law at the time, Proposition 21, some of you might recall, was now recently in operation. This law sought to classify and prosecute gang members as a particular class of criminality involving a unique form of gang violence. But during the trial and in the popular press, these young men were constructed not as not fitting the profile of gang members. And thus, though their actions, a group working together conspiring to commit violence, met the definition of a gang, a defense was successfully mounted to disarticulate their vigilante violence from that of gang violence and them from gangs. Indeed, the youth were humanized and constructed as rehabilitatable, and their violence against Mexicans that they falsely thought to be illegal was considered understandable because, as white youth, they were white people, and white people might be prone to doing violence against Mexican undocumented migrants, hence producing a kind of sympathy for whiteness. They were portrayed as having strong school attachments and of being from good families, and as such were configured as redeemable. Part of the problem with differential freedom in the United States and elsewhere under the law is the law itself. In States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity, Wendy Brown cautions us not to let injury and wounding function as Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment. And for Nietzsche, ressentiment is this kind of recurring hatred that's built into the everyday world, where some people are treated very poorly and then they immediately have this kind of emotional response, and their response is to try to get retribution for the damage, the injury done to them. He sees this as an historical process that happens over time, and so that groups of people are, over time, caught within this cyclical problematic. In particular, she warns us away from appeals to the state for retribution, remuneration, and rights. She rails against identity politics. She regards appeals to the state as appeals to certain moral behaviors sanctioned by repressive, ideological, and surveillance-prone state institutions. Aligned with Judith Butler in her work Excitable Speech, Brown regards as problematic the founding of political freedom on the construction of personal or group wounding that invokes the power of the state and its anticipated violence as protest's mode of enforceability. The state's role as the site of appeals to freedom is also of tremendous concern to Chandan Reddy in his book Freedom with Violence: Race, Sexuality, and the U.S. State. Like Brown and Butler, and drawing on Du Bois, Nella Larson, Kimberly Crenshaw, Reddy sees the state's role of enforcing freedom for some and unfreedom for others as highly problematic, but different from Brown and Butler, who worry about the founding politics as a legalistic framework erected to sanction deviance because of moral trespass. Reddy's critique is on a reliance on state violence as a means of ensuring and preserving freedoms, of founding identity claims on the denial of identities to others, and also this, what he calls the strange coupling, quote, strange coupling of civil rights and national security, end quote. Single identity movements such as gay marriage, and this is one of the foci of his book, tend to be premised on the inclusion of some groups, homosexuals, and the simultaneous and correlative exclusion of others, transgendered. Hence, freedom for some requires a consequent unfreedom for others, and rights are formed in contrast to that which is configured as irrational and non-normative. In her book, Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, Jasbir Puar is concerned not only with the broader distribution of freedoms and the inequitable access provided based on race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, and the like, but also with the unequal distribution of such freedoms within queer and queer of color contexts. So in that way, her critique and her analysis of freedom is very similar to Chandan Reddy's. Biopolitics is, thus, inherently discriminatory. Biopolitics is who lives and dies, Foucault says. That governments have decided that some people are unworthy of life and therefore can be treated in a particular way, and some people are worthy of life and therefore need to be treated in a certain way. And so that federal and government policies are made with this kind of understanding, although sometimes not clearly articulated. As she writes, biopolitics, quote, biopolitics delineate not only which queers live and which queers die, a variable and contestable demarcation, but also how queers live and die, end quote. Particularly troubling for her is what she labels homo-nationalism, which she says, quote, acts as a regulatory script not only for normative gayness, queerness, or homosexuality, but also of the racial and national norms that reinforce these sexual subjects. So McGee argued that liberty was the presence, or the feeling in the presence of power, or in the feeling in the presence of a sovereign. That is what liberty means. But I think that these works help to expand this idea quite a lot, to suggest that there's not a kind of unidirectional way in which power and freedom work, that it's much more complex than this. So in light of these revealing critical studies of freedom, I advocate for a significant expansion of McGee's and others' rhetorical project on liberty to include analysis of rhetorics of freedom and unfreedom in quotidian life. Of course, analysis of rhetorical objects such as speeches and missives produced and distributed by public speakers and heads of state are still necessary to understand the meaning of freedom. So, for instance, when George Bush argued that American forces were needed to liberate Kuwait, what guarantees were there that Kuwait's liberation by the United States was not a precondition to perpetual domination? When the United States offered to liberate the Filipinos from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, what guarantee did the Filipinos have that the United States would not then occupy the Philippines for the better part of the next century? Similarly, when the U.S. forces liberated Korea from Japan during World War II, what guarantee did the Koreans have that the United States would not then occupy Korea, transform South Korea into an economic tiger with an explicit U.S. policy to do so, ensure Korea's national surplus value for the U.S. through the regulation of tariffs and trade to ensure Korea's future dependency, and then engage in neoliberal economic practices that ultimately create codependent cultural, educational, political interpenetration with the balance of power recurringly favoring the U.S. More importantly are the questions one asks of those rhetorical objects that one studies, which should start with, what is freedom when it is uttered? Such a question would not assume the answer could be drawn from any given grammatical, linguistic, or pragmatic context like McGee suggested in his theorization of the ideograph and its usefulness in understanding liberty, but rather would require asking which question or questions to ask. Beginning with, is this a rhetoric of freedom or unfreedom? And I think sometimes it's hard to tell. Of course, very likely the answer would oscillate between freedom and unfreedom, maybe along a continuum. Maybe that's a way we should be thinking about it. And this suggests precisely how freedom is not any one thing, but necessarily, because it can never fully be attained or actualized, located somewhere between freedom and unfreedom. So in order to understand and kind of study these ideas, this theory of freedom, I think it's helpful to look at a particular case. And so I want to analyze freedom as it functions in immigration discourse. Freedom is central to thinking about undocumented migration. It is reminiscent of the Underground Railroad, people risking their lives for a chance to be human, a chance to survive by risking everything. And I'm skipping ahead for a second here, if I can find it. Chris McCrae, where's Chris? Told me that in Indiana, it was very helpful, that happened today. In Indiana, there's an Underground Railroad dark tour where you can pay to, or you don't pay, you do pay to go on the Underground Railroad and experience what it might be like to try to work toward freedom. So this is very, very timely indeed. An immigrant theme park that's a quote, an amusement park that allows ticket purchasers to experience what crossing the Rio Grande might be like, is an excellent rhetorical object to study in order to understand the competing desires, anxieties, fears, and sensations relating to rhetoric. So this was the first part of the talk was the heavy part. This part is maybe less heavy, but it gets heavier. In Alberto, in the state of Hidalgo in central Mexico, very close to Mexico City, since July of 2004, actually, those interested in what it might be like to cross the Rio Grande are able to experience such a crossing vicariously at Parque Eco Alberto. Patrons of the park can go on a 7.5 mile hike, 3 to 4 hours long, what they call the caminata nocturna, the night walk or night hike, with faux coyotes, the smugglers, and Border Patrol agents, La Migra, donning uniforms who combined help to stimulate a real border crossing. From the perspective of the creators of the park, quote, the aim is to dissuade would-be migrants, end quote. This is from a PBS article, or a special. A PBS special on the park quotes one of the developers who started the park after attempting the journey and ultimately turning back, saying, quote, but for us, it isn't just something rhetorical, but rather the opposite. Because we have endured, we have suffered of hunger, thirst, injustice, heat, cold. We have suffered from everything, end quote. Visitors who pay 250 pesos, about $20 US, enter the park at night, head into the woods, and enter a virtual frontera. The park functions as a tourist destination, so visitors can bathe in hot springs, enjoy river rafting, stay overnight in the cabins, go down a zip line, and go rappelling down rocks before enjoying an evening dark tour. Dark tourism, what is also called thanatourism, tragic tourism, and grief tourism, has become of popular interest to academics over the past several years, ranging from the more popular visiting of such places such as the Holocaust Museum, as if that could be popular, in Los Angeles, and Holocaust museums generally, or Alcatraz in San Francisco, a standard, if you will, to the more macabre tours of Auschwitz, the grounds of 9/11 in New York City, historical slave markets, the Underground Railroad in Indiana, the sites of devastation from Hurricane Katrina, and even now, the now defunct LA gang tours, where surveyed neighborhoods where gang members lived and played and worked to experience gang conditions, to name a few, such as tourism, has elements of simulation and visualization of taboo or tragic sites associated with current or historically spectacular and infamous activities or events. Some studies have focused on public relations side of dark tourism, the recasting of the nation in the face of national tragedy by emphasizing different elements using tourism. Others have emphasized the politico-ethical dimensions of such practices. And the best-known scholar in communication who's studied dark tourism, I'm sure you're familiar with her, Phaedra Pizzullo, takes a very different approach to dark tourism. One of her articles, in fact, says, what's so dark about dark tourism? And I tend to side pretty strongly with her view of this. First of all, I would question this concept of dark, meaning negative. And then secondly, I would question whether this kind of tourism is somehow negative, all right? I'm not sure that it is, or at least in the way that people are unhappy with it for being. Articles about this theme park in Mexico express a fascination with the uncanny. My, how interesting, how odd, how unusual to go there and go to an amusement park and try to cross the Rio Grande, taking the great trip. There aren't that many articles or video clips, and but there seem to be new articles and new video clips every year about it. The articles are scattered over time. They're divided between English and Spanish, in fact, about 50%. The park was, the story goes that the park was created by an indigenous community, the Hananu, 2,000 of whom still live in the region and 1.5 thousand of whom now live in the United States. So this is a community that has been devastated by poverty and economic oppression, and has been forced because of the economics to do something desperate. And the main act of desperation is to cross the border to the United States. Hananu people live in abject poverty. Huge numbers leave the region, and now, because of the park, many of them have returned. Maribel Garcia, an administrator for the park, made clear the goal of the administrators and creators of the park is to prevent people from making that journey, from leaving the region, from taking their families away from their friends. Quote, "Our objective is to stop the immigration that exists among our citizens, principally from the state of Mexico to the U.S., she says in Spanish. Articles, films, and TV spots show participants on site, and they try to capture the real-life experience of evading the Border Patrol. So now I'm going to show you a clip from one of these films. So some of the articles and video clips express the fear that the park will provide a trial run, give would-be border crossers practice, or otherwise increase border breaking. And so on the plane here from Detroit, this is my connection from Salt Lake City to Detroit, Detroit to here. On my plane trip from Detroit to here, I was sitting next to this gentleman, and I was looking over my talk, and he kind of leaned into me and started looking at what I was writing. He said, I don't know if it was because I was talking about homo terrorism, homo nationalism, and, or what. I'm not sure what he was inspired to talk to me about. But he said, what are you writing about? And I explained to him the talk and basically gave a pre-talk, which was, I appreciated. And he said, so what do you think about undocumented migration? And he says, I'm from a rural community. And he clearly was opposed to undocumented migration, but he was willing to have this conversation with me. But a lot of the reaction to this is, they're training them to come over here. They're making it easier for them to cross the border, right? That's one reading, and that's why I say, the reading of kind of rhetorics of freedom, I think, is quite multiple. One example of this is one Huffington Post news program from 2012 juxtaposed two interviewees. Two of them were from Mexico, who were Mexicans, and two were from the U.S., and they were Latinos. And the Latinos, really the two Latinos, and this is not necessarily suggesting that all U.S. Latinos think this way, but they argued that this was really offensive. This made light of the difficulty of undocumented people to migrate to the U.S. This was something that is highly problematic, that they would make money off of this even more so. The two Mexican folks who were analyzing this said, hey, we think this is great. They're trying to help their community. They're actually taking on this very public problem and doing something about it. So this suggests that there's not just one way to read, I think, this complex text, the park, or the complex discourse around the park. Only one article mentions NAFTA and increasing poverty of Mexicans resulting from U.S. trade relations. Articles tend to be descriptive because they're not sure what they should be saying, I think, about it, and they're not analytical or critical, although you get the one critical take. Even though the park is 10 years old, English language news is still confused to this day about how to analyze and think about the tour. So I think it requires some analysis. The analysis is complex because the rhetoric of the park works at many registers. Like Pizzolo, I suggest that this dark tour, and discourse about it has potential not only for understanding and empathy, but also for the recognition of power, as well as relative access to freedom. Central to this discourse is irony, paradox, and satire. The positives associated with the tour are therefore complicated. How are we to understand freedom as it relates to La Caminata Nocturna? On the one hand, as the story goes, immigration from Mexico to the US is the road to freedom. That's the normal, ordinary narrative we hear in the United States. Freedom from poverty, freedom derived from the wealth that capitalism offers and provides, reuniting with family members, right? That's a freeing effect of making the migration, and the freedom of education and the hope for one's children's future. That's a standard narrative within immigration discourse. On the other hand, staying in Mexico is constructed as improving one's community, creating economic possibilities at home. Nationalism supporting Mexico, not the United States, through one's labor. Ecological harmony, which it's called Eco Park, right? It's about ecology and the respect for plants. And indigenous people on video talk about the experience of the preservation of the land, like indigenous people who had lived there for decades and generations. Resistance and the freedom of self-determination. Still, freedom is regarded as individual in this context and not social, for the most part. The conditions of Agamben's bare life, resulting from transnational global capital intensification of products on demand, easy to acquire labor, decreased tariffs and other trade barriers, increasing access to goods across geographical space, the speed of product flow, the production of camps, in Agamben's words, for laborers in non-national locales where labor, trade, production, regulations are not upheld. All of these are de-emphasized in the discourse about the park. And they're difficult to read into if you're trying to. The freedom to stay at home, however, is ironic, one quite different from the discourse of Western and Southwestern US as part of Mexico discourse. Maintaining one's culture, helping the community, patronizing the Mexican state, and not risking one's life is a novel, even compelling counter-narrative to standard US immigration discourse. But left out of this narrative are the conditions that produce poverty globally, unequal relations of power that both promote and restrict immigration. The US nation-state requires cheap immigrant laborers as part of its political economy and unwritten economic policy. The de facto guest worker programs that exist, I think, even though they're not called that anymore, that prevents undocumented migrants from having any rights in order to ensure maximum capital flexibility and their return. Mimi Nguyen's theory of the gift of freedom helps us analyze La Caminata Nocturna, as well as the U.S. never actually gives the gift of freedom to undocumented Mexican migrants, right? The gift is taken. In other words, they have to cross against the U.S.'s government's will. Thus, there is no necessary fealty. These are not immigrants given citizenship or immigrants given the right to citizenship. Therefore, there's no requirement of fealty, no requirement of thanks. Although the dominant immigration discourse in the United States still implies that there should be. With regard to the interlink between violence and freedom that Chandan Reddy discusses, we learn that while violence, with Reddy's argument, is used on behalf of freedom, so violence is necessary to secure freedom abroad, it is also used in immigration discourse to restrict the freedom of others. Violence is necessary to prevent people from coming to the United States, to prevent their freedom. Following Giorgio Agamben, Lisa Cacho, and Mimi Nguyen, the status of undocumented migrants means they cross without rights and without status. And as such, at least staying in Mexico means recognition by the state and the reduction of bare life that is more livable in some ways. And following Reddy, what are implications for those immigrants who cannot stay back? So one of the things that I think the discourse doesn't address is the people who cannot not cross. And that's one major area that the discourse and the films don't address. But the idea that tourists have to travel to Mexico to find out what undocumented migrants might have to go through, what their conditions of living are on the ground, that many are indigenous migrants and families dispersed across the Americas, that the U.S. enforcement of the borders is violent and dangerous, that the coyotes seek to exploit would-be migrants who give them money with little regard for their humanity, and that the correlation between the drug markets does, what the coyotes and the drug markets does, suggests educational possibilities, as well as possibilities for broader social change. Most importantly, this case helps us understand better the rhetorical construction of freedom, definitions of freedom, and the analytics necessary to understanding complex relationships and contexts undergirding it. And it gives us a way of thinking through freedom in other discourse. So in this talk, I've suggested the importance of a critical theory of freedom to communication, reviewed contemporary scholarship on the concept, discussed the notion of dark tours and tourism, and described and analyzed the case of La Caminata Nocturna as a way of understanding the subtle interplay of rhetorics of freedom and migration. Communication scholars, including rhetoricians, have a particular stake, or should have, in how we understand rhetorics of freedom and unfreedom, and the way that they function, and how they are historicized and theorized. After last summer, what Derek Busher and I label the summer of the whistleblower, with Bradley Manning having been found guilty of espionage for leaking government documents to WikiLeaks, after Edward Snowden finally found asylum in Russia after leaking documents that first revealed massive surveillance campaigns conducted by the CIA and the U.S. security generally of China, and then later of U.S. citizens themselves. And while Glenn Greenwald's series in The Guardian revealed daily more and more information about the expansiveness of the U.S. surveillance program, and more recently how the U.S. government tracks email messages and cell phone conversations of ordinary U.S. citizens and gives such information to Israel, we should ask, quote, what does free mean in the phrase free speech and in the phrase freedom of expression? In a context in which the appeals to freedom and liberation are intrinsic to advertising, ranging from weight loss supplements to car ads, where ads for pickups give you the freedom to drive off-road across previously untrammeled wilderness, where ads to join the military promise the freedom from student loan debt, where weight loss ads promise the feeling of being free in one's own clothes. What does freedom mean? And what unfreedoms pertain to such promises of freedom? Basic to freedom is communication. As I have suggested, actualized freedom from injustice, oppression, and poverty requires discourse, a means for changing problematic conditions. A project that seeks to understand rhetorics of freedom and unfreedom is a start to understanding better the possibility for social improvement. Furthermore, given all that is happening right now in our society, we would be wise to have an educated answer to those who use rights and freedoms to justify unfreeing ideas, thoughts, and actions. If communication scholars, experts on the research on the subject of free speech and of appeals to liberty in American public address, freedom of expression, the rhetoric of social movements, international NGO communication, and the like, don't know the answer to what freedom means, how is a socially productive conception of freedom possible? That is, how is freedom possible? Thank you. Sure. Happy to take questions. But I've been talking for a long time, so you may not want more of this.
I really enjoyed the talk. I think there's a lot to be considered in terms of dark tourism. Actually, I'm teaching women in communication right now. One of the things that we talked about just recently last week was the Ani DeFranco debacle with the plantation that she had was intending to use for a music retreat for feminist musicians. Yeah. And so I'm interested to hear a little bit about particularly why choose this particular text, this park, this tour, to help discuss the way that we can think more critically about things like freedom and immigration.
There are so many reasons. Having kind of written a book on immigration discourse, and I'm presently writing another book on immigration discourse, it's been very U.S. kind of focused. Now, I've been interested in discourse outside of the U.S., but principally have focused on discourse within the U.S. And so to learn about this park was just really intriguing and challenging, and actually challenging of a lot of the discourse that I've been studying, as well as a lot of the theoretical work, as I've kind of suggested, because it is just confusing from a U.S. perspective, especially, I think, confusing how to take it. Because, as a scholar of race and someone who studies racial masquerade and racial impersonation and the politics and ethics behind it, kind of seeing a staging like this just sort of grates at my conception of what's right? But that conception of what's right really challenges me to kind of rethink, oh, okay, so, there's a way of thinking about this that in fact doesn't have to do with my perspective at all, in at least the perspective that I've had. And so it had a lot to teach me, but I think also when I started reading into the discourse, what I was finding is people, were avoiding making any kind of analysis of it. They were just describing it, and they didn't have a critical analysis to make of it. So they didn't know where to start. They didn't have a context. And I think if there's anything that critical scholars who study newspapers and news discourse have to offer journalists, it's that context matters. And so I was really interested in trying to figure out the contexts that would help to kind of position this sort of unreadable text for many as a text that can be kind of critically understood and evaluated.
Yes. I guess to my mind, when I think about dark prison, I think about places like, touring Auschwitz or the beaches of Normandy. I grew up near Gettysburg, so Civil War back. These are quiet, closed, where we don't think of such activeness happening in the activity, and I think that really lends to what the rest of the conversation is about.
Right, and I mean, I don't say anything about Disney in the paper, but I think that there's a whole additional thing that could be done with Disney and dark tourism.
Yes, so building on that, this talk kind of makes me wonder about the degrees of darkness when it comes to tourism. I am thinking about the ways that maybe the dark part is sometimes masked in these historic tours. Like I'm thinking particularly about what is ironically called the Cracker Country installation at the Florida State Fairgrounds, where you're supposed to walk through and think about all the struggles of establishing agriculture in Florida. And there's all these old white farmers, and not a single mention of the ways that slavery had so much to do with the establishment of agriculture in the South. And so how walking through this, you're supposed to kind of experience what it's like to pick cotton and do things like that, something that's completely devoid of any of the dark part of this history. And so, kind of what affect has to do with going to these tours.
Definitely, and how our affects are already kind of predetermined for us in relation to that. That's very interesting. And it's called that, right? It's not. They don't actually put it on the.
And they have this whole sign that explains where the term cracker came from, just for clarification, so nobody, thinks that means something it actually doesn't.
Okay. Interesting. Yes.
Building off of the simulation, you're talking about going back to the context of it, meaning political and economic ties to this kind of institution or affiliation. What did you find in terms of that? Are they organizational based or government?
I didn't go into as much depth with that, but I have a lot to say on that. So these are folks who did the migration, so they've already done it. And so part of what they bring back is to try to convey the horrors of it, how it's negative and what the ramifications are, and to kind of imply death, actually, as a possible consequence for the migration. But their analysis is much more complex than just that, right? They're interested in rebuilding the economy of Alberta, and the economy which was economists call it one of the poorest areas of Mexico. So very, very desperate poverty. And you can see as a result of this why people migrated. But since the park, and you'll get this in the film a little bit, since the park has been put there, a lot of people have returned, and the economic logic of the park is very socialist. in the sense that all of the profits from the park are actually redistributed to all of the members of the community equally. And so, it's been talked of, at least in the Mexican publications, as a positive thing, and I think, but that's a problem in a way, in the sense that, so that's why I keep going back and forth, right, in the paper, because the nationalism implied, like, to kind of revere the Mexican state, which is engaged in an attempt to be part of, NAFTA and other kinds of transnational economic policies for the economic future of Mexico, is something that the park is being read into. So, but what I like about the park, is that even as I'm trying to kind of position it in that way, there are ways in which the park frustrates that reading. So the ecological part of it, there's a contradictory part. They bring people onto the, land, which destroys the land, but by showing them the beauty of the land, they preserve the land. And so the land has now become a kind of preserved space as a result of the park. And so I just really enjoy thinking about it because it challenges in very many ways a kind of knee-jerk, critical approach. And so I find that we have to have a more critical or a more complex critical theory to be able to start to understand that context and those contexts. So I probably said more and didn't say enough about what you wanted. So.
Just what about in a classroom setting if a student speaks out with a racial derogatory comment? What could be said about that? Still preserving, if they enact the freedom of speech, still preserving that in a way, yet countering.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I don't know if you've had this happen in a class, if you've taught a class or were in a class in which this occurred, but so many things can happen. Like it can really affect other students as well, depending on how the teacher addresses that. And like acknowledging that freedom of speech is this kind of ideological position that people revere within the United States and use as a kind of rationale for even uncivil behavior. Puts it in a certain kind of context, right? It begins to put it into a context. So I think then we can talk about how the history of freedom of speech has been used. We can use examples. I'm thinking of Skokie. I don't know if that's probably too old for some of you. Skokie, Illinois, where the Supreme Court ended up supporting the KKK, going through a largely Jewish neighborhood, spewing kind of anti-Jewish sentiment, right? And so the court supported that for a principle that the most marginalized voices need to be heard, even if those marginalized voices are ones that you don't agree with. Okay? So that kind of puts a frame around why it's helpful, but then we can talk about whiteness and the privilege of whiteness and how people try to retain or maintain privilege, and how when whiteness is under assault, there's a certain kind of desperation that people feel to kind of regain the power that's being lost. And in invoking kind of whiteness in the classroom and using freedom of speech, that concept, right? It's a strategic move. Yes, maybe for a good principle, but probably not for a civil outcome. And so a civil outcome requires respect across. And freedom of speech makes sense within a context of respect. Does that help? So that's like how I would start. I don't know.
So
One way.
You could say that you would,
layers.
Yeah. In the sense, in the time, in the moment, you could say, well, with all respect, and take that. Well, no, we're not going to ask you to take it back.
That's right.
Respect.
Yeah. Yeah. Respect and explain why there's respect, but that there has to be respect for that to have meaning. But I think part of it is developing the context, talking about race as a context, talking about privilege as a context, talking about relational power, even within the classroom, talking about the larger social forces. Because in a classroom, you're trying to teach every student, not just one student. And so it's interesting you raise that. Because it happens a lot, has happened to me recently. Anything else? Yes.
Thank you very much. So I'm also very confused about what to feel upon seeing that video. You were confused. And as you were talking after that, I realized that part of this has to do with the sort of highly mediatized, almost like reality TV version of it that we're seeing. We're not really experiencing what it means to be in the park, but we're seeing an aspect of it. And I've been in a similar, like involved in Sarajevo, similar sites of war for war tourism. I went through these like tours where you go through the tunnels, see these like buildings, or like they say like there's a minefield there, like we can't walk there, etc. In a very commodifying way, like that this is also used, but at the same time, it doesn't feel as bad as this right now. So I guess there are other questions of intentionality and the experiencing the sites themselves that sort of shift our experiences of this. And I'm I feel fortunate that I see this and like I'm looking at it in a different way. One thing I was wondering, you spoke a lot about, very articulate way of the use of freedom as a concept, within U.S. foreign policy, and of course not just U.S. foreign policy, but specifically within U.S. foreign policy, which is built on, there's barely ever any wars within the U.S. land, so it's always built on this context of liberating these other places. I'm not an American citizen, and I didn't come to this country until I was 25, but I've had a construction of the U.S., which is, a lot of that comes from film, which is, the greatest, American commodity in my mind. Like the thing
You must be a communication scholar. You're not a nuclear scientist.
But, so I guess I was wondering, so what I'm seeing that is not U.S. liberating these places, but a lot of this thing, even with now, when people talk about their Marines, their troops, people who I know, everybody's like, thank you for fighting for our freedom. So this is, this is for the American people's freedom. And I wondered if, questioning of the concept, kind of like what David Harvey's cases of Poland. If this concept of freedom is serving as some kind of an ideological state apparatus for the imagination of the U.S. as this like
benevolent
utopian community.
Okay.
Yes, benevolent and utopian. I guess like this utopian and very much internalized identification of this country for its citizens, because people are very proud of this from what I see from coming from this perspective. American people are very proud of this freedom, so I wanted
there's real opportunities here for good cartoons because let's say somebody visiting abroad and saying, we could give you freedom. Just come to the U.S. You could be free. And some scholars, I think, have made that critique as a part of their analyses, but there hasn't been as much public discourse about it. And then, like I say, in these articles and in the films and such, they're not trying to understand it in this contextual way, in this relational way. They're trying to understand it in a kind of absolute way, or trying to make sense of it within a personal way. So, but happy to talk to you afterward. I hear the clock is ticking.